Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, HBI.
HBI. Yeah, thank you.
Tony's got the bad idea for us this week. Tony, what are we talking about?
We're going to be talking about Fordlandia.
Is this a land that was created by the Ford Motor Company?
Oh, it's definitely a town created by the Ford Motor Company. I'm pretty sure that the land was created by, like, the earth cooling and creating Brazil.
Okay, Mr. Smart Alec. I see what you did there, and as a dad, I approve of these style of jokes.
Anyway, Henry Ford has been on a few of these episodes, but that happens when you take big chances while trying to change the world. In this particular episode, Ford was trying to shore up his supply line for rubber. He was tired of not being able to outcompete people on the Asian rubber market, which was very much controlled by the British. He wanted to make sure that Ford was never wanting for cheap rubber, so he decided to go back to the source. Or rather, to make his own source in Brazil. Prior to this, Brazil was actually just the place to go for rubber, but because of blight and so many other issues with parasites, the British decided to smuggle out a bunch of rubber seeds and set up their own plantations in Sri Lanka. So it kind of crashed the economy. So the people in Brazil, when they heard that he was coming back, were super excited to get this rolling again.
And in business circles, this tactic is known, I think, as vertical integration. If you are making a thing and you need another thing to make the thing that you're making, yes, words, you buy the company or the land or the ability to make that thing that you need to make the main thing.
Yep, cut out the middleman and just do it yourself.
Yes, save that money.
Yeah, it's not always the best possible plan, but a lot of times it really does save these companies millions. Nestled deep in the Amazon is a town called Fordlandia. When I say deep, I mean incredibly deep. Like 18 hours by boat from the nearest major town deep, and that's today, not even back then. In this semi-ruin, you can find the old houses, pools, shops, churches, and even the overgrown remnants of a golf course.
Are you kidding me? 18 hours?
18 hours by boat after you fly in.
So it's like you get there, you travel 18 hours by boat, and if something happens, you are 18 hours from civilization in the best case scenario, assuming that your boat doesn't sink or your engine conk out. That's so far out in the nothing.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why they built a hospital here as well. Like a theater, all sorts of stuff. Yeah. They loaded up a bunch of barges and basically just brought everything you could think of. And even still, it wasn't quite everything they needed.
I'm sure that'll come up later.
Out in this area, you can also find a whole lot of nothing, as the Ford Company purchased 2.5 million acres of land. Now, for reference, New York City is about 205,000 acres, so just under 10% of that. Yellowstone National Park is 2.2 million acres, or you can call it about 3.25 Rhode Islands. We're talking about a lot of land here. A lot of rocky, hard terrain in the middle of nowhere.
Is this where you want to grow rubber?
Funny thing about that...
I'm thinking of rainforest and stuff. Is there vegetation here, or is this like deserty type rock?
This is extreme jungle. Like, this is full-on Amazon rainforest. But the problem is that the soil is very, very rocky, which is not where you want to actually grow your rubber trees. This goes back to some very odd things about Henry Ford, where he didn't like paying for expertise on certain things because he felt like you could basically brute force it with the way you do business. And he didn't have somebody kind of scope out the soil to see if this was a good idea beforehand. He just had one of his advisors go, they made the big deal, and they just went after it after that.
I mean, it worked out for him in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, Henry Ford has been on this list a few times, same with the Edsel and a lot of other different aspects of the Ford Motor Company, and it's because he took a lot of big chances, just not all of them panned out. He actually tried to make a 75-mile city in Alabama at one point. He wanted to make like the company town, but it never really got off the ground in America. So this was his attempt after that.
When you say it didn't get off the ground, can I go to Alabama and see some Ford ruins somewhere?
I feel like this one just never quite really got rolling, but the site that I was trying to read about it from was behind a paywall. So I didn't look very
Yeah.
much deeper into the Alabama failure.
That's something we run into a lot. The paywall and also the book that it has all the information you want, but it's been out of print for 20 years and it's $50 on Amazon. And there's no digital copy.
Or the documentary that would be perfect but isn't available for any download and nobody has a torrent for, this random documentary about Fordlandia.
Yep.
Sources are weird. Anyway, Ford was introducing the Model A when they mentioned to the press and investors that they had spent a lot of money trying to acquire the land in the Amazon and they were about ready to create their own rubber supply. And there were a lot of people that gave really different amounts of money on this. Like the one that seemed most consistent was $20 million. Somebody said $200 million and $1920, and I feel like that was just way too much. Like I found 4 different sources for how much was spent. Someone said $125,000, and that just didn't seem like enough. But according to the sources that seem to quote the same thing the most, it would be around $240 million in today's money. And as a side note, the Model A is definitely not part of the bad idea. The Model A was the follow-up to the Model T, and it was a fantastic car for the time. The plan was ambitious. It would take over this part of the Amazon and bring the American lifestyle to the workers of Brazil. Fordlandia would have well-built houses, immaculate streets, running water, fire hydrants, churches, stores, and all the amenities a town would need. It was to be one of the largest company towns, which will surely be an episode of Bad Ideas in the future. I don't know if you know much about company towns, but there's some shady stuff there.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that whole concept up when you first mentioned the idea of Ford building their own town, and I'm sure people are generally familiar with it. It was mostly associated with the coal mining companies, although I'm sure other people did it.
Yeah.
But the highest number that I'm aware of were run by the coal mining companies.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, a company town is basically this. It's where a company buys up a lot of land, they keep their employees there, they have basically everything taken care of, and in some cases they create their own currency so the employees are discouraged from leaving. It gets real weird.
You're like, you can't get out of the ecosystem because suddenly they're paying you in company credits or whatever it would be, and then those don't spend outside the company town. It's a whole thing.
With this, they also wanted to bring Protestant American values to the town. There would be required events such as poetry readings and singing, as well as a full ban on alcohol to go with the rigid work schedule. Ford looked at this area as a utopian idea for the type of Americana he couldn't find at home, one free from unions, politicians, bankers, militarists, and, as many journalists who were talking about this seemed to make a very keen mention of, Jews.
I was going to say, I bet there was lots of Jews, though, because of Henry Ford being so accepting of everybody.
But that was something where I was like, was he really all that anti-Semitic? And it's like, oh, he ran a newspaper that was very, very, very blatantly anti-Semitic. So, yeah, not so much a good thing there. In July 1928, large boats worked their way up the river, bringing cranes, machinery, prefabricated buildings, huge amounts of food and medicine, and anything the town would need to get started. Unfortunately, because of how deep this was in the rainforest, they had to do all the shipping during the rainy season because it was just not quite deep enough to get these giant ships up that far into the Amazon. So they had to be very, very careful about getting it that deep.
So you need the river to be deep enough for your giant boat to get up there, but that means you have to do everything in the sort of non-stop torrential rain that you get during that time of year?
Yeah, it's like a 4 or 5 month section where it's just awful, awful weather.
You said there is a movie about this, yeah?
There's a documentary. I couldn't find a place to watch it, but I think if people search hard enough, they might be able to find a VOD of it. And it is cool looking at the pictures of this town. It was a very immaculate, nice looking town, and a lot of the buildings are still standing today, even just like normal houses. So it's not like they gave this a strong effort, but we're going to get into more of the reasons why it fell apart later. Trouble started immediately when the managers of Fordlandia, W.L. Reeves Blakely and Jorge Villares, decided to start cleaning the rainforest during the rainy season. They also didn't bring enough gas to power their saws, their machinery, or pretty much anything else, so instead of using power tools to bring down these enormous trees, crews just hacked all day long at trees and weren't able to really start fires because the kerosene would burn out because of how torrential the rains were. They couldn't burn stumps, and over the course of many months, they only made small sections of open land because of how just hard this area was and how deep the forest was.
This is like a flashback to some of the stories you hear about the pilgrims coming over on Plymouth Rock, where they're just like desperately trying to get everything going against them.
Yeah, it's just so much adversity for so little gain.
Well, I mean, long term.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, it was slow progress. They made it, but it was a rough go. Working in weather that was often over 100 degrees and laden with swarms of bugs and humidity, there was only so much daily process that they could make. The workers were paid fairly handsomely, though, for the time. Ford doubled the national average of 20 cents per day to 40, and that was the main reason why he was able to get so many people going in. The town initially wasn't this big. It got over 5,000 at one point and was being designed to have about 10,000 people, so it would actually be a pretty good-sized town. But it never quite got there. The mortality rate shot up as people clearing the jungle died of insect-borne fevers and pathogens. Poisonous snakes in the undergrowth took their toll as well. The heat was causing a lot of people to get sick and collapse, dysentery became a problem, and they even had a few people taken in the night by jaguars.
Oh. Yep, that's one that you don't get when you're a pilgrim.
Yeah, that's
on Plymouth Rock.
Maybe not Plymouth Rock, but they did have some jaguars in the Carolinas and the Florida region, so they might have lost a couple to that. Or were those panthers? I don't even know anymore.
Is there a difference? Nobody knows the difference between a panther and a jaguar. They might be the same animal. They're like crocodiles and alligators.
If you know the difference, just add us at Human Echoes. In November, the anger boiled over. After another serving of rotten beef and fish, workers grabbed their machetes and chased the cooks and other American workers into the woods and into the river. Ford dismissed his current leader, Reeves Blakely, and hired a new man named Einar Oxholm. People described him as a big man with a weak mind, who had absolutely no experience with botany, plantation management, or anything else relevant other than being a seafaring captain, so he had a little bit of management experience. Henry Ford often hated expertise and thought it was overrated, so the hire made sense in the way he's always done things.
This is a weird attitude this guy has. I know I commented earlier that, well, I guess it worked out, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of a very different character. It reminds me of how Mao felt about like expertise and the idea of people being specialized in certain tasks. When I was studying The Great Leap Forward, he didn't trust people who were, who had studied things about farming and studied things about irrigation. He said, no, the people will decide. The common man's common sense can override anything any expert can come up with. And it's really weird that, like, union-busting, hyper-capitalist Henry Ford had exactly the same mindset.
Oh, it's always like people say political leanings are like left and right. I always think it's more of a circle and you get back to the same spot when you go far enough.
I guess
that also fits in with like what the Khmer Rouge and all these other communist states did. They were all following that Mao order.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense I say it makes sense. It doesn't make sense for anybody, but ideologically, at least the Khmer Rouge and Mao, those two people have the same set of general political ideas. So you can maybe understand why they're going to get some of the same types of end state ideas out of them. I don't know where Henry Ford got this idea. He must have got burned by some experts. I mean, because that'll happen, right? Somebody will tell you something. They went to school for, 8 years to learn, and you'll be like, oh, I guess that's accurate. And then you put it into motion, and it turns out they had no idea.
Especially in the teens and 20s, whenever engineering and things like that were... Like, they weren't exactly new, but there was a lot of things that were brand new going into automobiles.
But that's not always true. Just because you can't always trust the experts doesn't mean you should hit the experts on the head with the shovel and bury them in a shallow grave.
Yeah, that's why we have an anti-vax movement now.
Yeah. What, so that people will self-select out of the gene pool?
I'm just saying, they're picking, like, average Joe's opinions on YouTube videos over doctors. That expertise doesn't mean anything. The biggest problem for Oxholm was labor. People didn't see the point in laboring hard for the Ford company when they could easily forage in the jungle for anything they needed food-wise. And a lot of times they only had to do this for a few months a year to get enough resources that they and their families would be fine. Other people would work for a week or two, collect their money, and simply leave. The headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan simply didn't understand why the people wouldn't settle into a steady labor job where they worked 6 days a week from 9 to 5. They also hadn't accounted for most of the people living in the river valleys using a sort of barter and credit system for cash. So even if they were paid well, it wasn't as valuable for them since they were so far from major cities. The Amazon just didn't have much to buy. Other than tools and things for the home farms, the incentive wasn't there to just keep on grinding for more money.
That is so fascinating.
And it's also like they have a very different way of doing time whenever you're in an agrarian society like that, where it's like it's based on not so much like the precision of watches, but when the sun sets, when the sun rises, and also like whenever you're like doing things in the dry season versus what you're doing in the wet season. And they just had a very different mindset on survival and work. So it just didn't quite mesh with this American ideal of what factory workers were supposed to be.
Right, because you kind of, I can understand where the Ford people are coming from. They're like, listen, we're paying you a ton more than you would normally make. You're out there in the beautiful wild jungles of the Amazon. What more could you possibly want? I mean, and the working hours are probably starting to get standardized at this point, I would imagine. Would you say 9 to 5, 9 to 6?
It was pretty much a 9 to 5, 9 to 6 type thing where like you heard that work whistle and you were done and the next shift came in.
And that's pretty legit at the time. I mean, the idea of a 40-hour work week was not brand new, but still in its infancy sort of formation stage. So you can see why on paper the people from Ford would have thought, yeah, sure, let's do this. This is a great idea.
Yeah, they're not forcing 8-year-olds to work in like factories for 16 hours a day. It's like there was some weird stuff happening in the 1800s in that industrial revolution. Like this was whenever they were starting to get it kind of in line.
You might say there's some of that still happening in China with products we use today. I don't know exactly how much of that is hype and, propaganda one way or the other.
It's always a bit hard to tell. It's like we're using these devices filled with like coltan minerals and all sorts of other things that are just really not that great for human rights. But hey, we're here now.
Yes, it's not us that has to mine the horrible minerals and die.
Yeah, or work in the factories with bad everything. But yeah, Ford had to shift its tactic a little bit and set up offices in some cities a little bit further in the mainland where they were able to recruit a fair amount of people to get there. An influx of about 5,000 people filled the town, and they started to make shanties to live in, small restaurants and stores started to pop up, as well as thatched roof brothels. As Vice slowly entered the camp, Ford insisted that American law be the rule for the city. He banned alcohol, but small riverboats brought it on a daily basis for thirsty workers. Ford had actually been a large driving force in Prohibition in Michigan and in the United States, and hated the thought that his engineered city would be filled with alcohol. Oxholm attempted to stop the debauchery, but when he shut down the brothels and bars, they simply built new ones on an island not far from Fordlandia. They actually had to build these ones on stilts because it was a place they could flood, so they just built an odd little river city in the middle of that area. And later it was found out that Oxholm had developed a taste for the local liquor known as Kachaka, which I think we actually had on a Booze and Booze episode, like one of our first ones over on the Human Echoes channel.
So these people who are coming to serve alcohol and be prostitutes to the company town workers, are they from Brazil? Or
they're from cities in Brazil.
Okay, so it wasn't natives, which is another thing that I had a question about. Like, when Henry Ford bought this land, I assume he's not buying it from, like, local chieftains and stuff, so there's probably some people who have some issues with that anyway. But still, it's, what kind of person is like, there's a town 18 hours up that river. I'm gonna go and get paid to have sex with the people in the town 18 miles away from everybody else.
It's probably the same type of women. Yeah, it's probably the same type of women that went and made money hand over fist in mining towns in the frontier times.
I guess they weren't concerned with the problem with the barter system and stuff.
Yeah.
But they got to drink, so I'm beginning to think that the real problem here was that Ford was down on the drinking and everybody else was like, yeah, the money's great actually, but no.
Yeah, what else are they going to buy with the money? There's nothing there, and I'm sure the people that were dragging the Kachaka up the river were gouging prices a little bit, too. As 1929 came to a close, more than 90 people had been buried in the corporate cemetery. Most had been workers, but a few were just passing through. This was mostly because of malnutrition and infection, malaria, and things like that, but a few times it was from exhaustion and various other things that happened while they were trying to till and make this land into something stronger. They had really high standards for what they wanted to plant for rubber trees. They figured that a pair of workers could plant like 200 rubber trees in a day. And it wasn't enough space, and it wasn't really thought out all that well.
I mean, I can't imagine that the hundreds of thousands of acres, or no, 2 million acres you said, right?
Yeah.
I can't imagine that's not enough space. They just didn't clear. It wasn't not enough usable space, I assume is what you're saying.
It's actually a little bit more of Ford's idea on, he says if you have a lot of light, you can put the machines closer together and you can make things more efficient. And so he's going off of what it is for machinery, not realizing that having the trees together allows funguses, parasites, plant-eating caterpillars, and things like that to just walk from one tree to the next.
How is this guy having exactly the same problem that Mao will have like 50 years later? For the almost issues? Exactly the same reasons. The Mao does the same thing. I don't know why this is like a weird flashback to the Great Leap Forward, but Mao was like, well, just plant those plants closer together. We'll get more yield. And the farmers are like, you moron, that's not how it works.
Yep.
And then they killed the farmers who said you moron and did it anyway. And the people who got killed ahead of time at least didn't have to starve to death.
Yeah, it's almost like you should listen to people with experience.
At least take it into account!
Yeah. This is the year that things turned very bad for Oxholm. 4 of his children ended up being buried in this cemetery as well. His maid also lost her arm to a crocodile, like midday, because she was bathing in the river.
Extra oof.
In all, there were around 270 graves by 1930, so one more year, and they tripled the amount of graves at the site. The conditions and rules for factory workers continued to grow out of hand. For people that didn't really keep time, it was a harsh adjustment to be there on time, hit the clock, and just be there. Add that to the rules that kept piling up that made workers volatile, such as they were no longer allowed to go home for lunch or breakfast. They had to eat like canned peaches and things that were provided by the Ford company, as well as pay for it out of their paychecks. Like, they just started to get real tense. Whenever they were forced to stand in lines instead of having a waiter type service at the cafeteria, they said that they weren't dogs, and things started to get real tense, especially because the cafeteria was a giant concrete structure without air conditioning in 100-degree weather. So it was basically just an oven for all these workers. When a very disliked Ford company administrator got into a fight with one of the workers, it started a riot. People tore the cafeteria apart with whatever tools they could find. After that, they cut the power, broke windows, and looked to tear down anything with a Ford insignia. They ripped apart tractors and vehicles, left the camp in ruins, and many of them disappeared after that time.
And that's how Henry Ford avoided dealing with unions, I guess.
Yes.
Kind of a swing and a miss there, my dude.
Yeah, that was miscalculated. At this point, Henry Ford went into damage control mode, sending out press releases detailing how wondrous Fordlandia was, how high wages ruled, and the science of growing rubber was being expanded on. Over the next decade, people would slowly return to Fordlandia. It was actually more like 5 years, not quite a decade, for another round of growth. But Ford talked more about how this was becoming a humanitarian civilizing project than it was for the need for rubber. They were trying to put a positive spin on what they were bringing to all these people in Brazil.
So his whole spin was, well, we didn't make any money, but look at how much we're improving the lives of the natives.
Yeah, and they thought they were going to be making money by being able to sell all the Amazon wood, but a lot of the wood was unusable, or during the dry season, they set a lot of it on fire, so there'd be like a 100-foot wall of flame and just burn everything. It was not a good way to make sure you got that usable wood.
There's not anything about this other than the image, right? Like, the image of this town carved out of the wilderness is really, really neat. But all of the details, once you actually get into how it was run, it seems really, really fraught. There's nothing about this that ultimately worked.
Yeah, exactly. I kept wondering whenever I was reading about this if he had picked somewhere that was actually closer to the cities, maybe bought a little bit less land, if there would have been a huge success. Like, if you're drawing from people that are actually looking for that sort of work and like a little bit more accustomed to the Ford style, and just kind of scale back production from 2.2 or 2.5 million acres to something a little more manageable. it just seemed like it was too much too fast to really manage.
That's what you would say, Tony, because you're one of those crazy experts.
And I have hindsight, so it's a little easier for me.
That's true, too.
The new manager, Archibald Johnston, worked hard to make proper housing for the residents, making adobe houses with thatched roofs. He wanted these simple homes to have water and electricity, and a lot of them were able to get that. Unfortunately, the Ford company wanted these to look like standard Midwestern homes, so they had the rest done with steel roofs and asbestos insulation. In the Amazon, that is basically deciding to build an oven for your people.
In a time before air conditioning was even really a thing.
Yeah. Like, they had an ice maker on site, so they could get ice for their ice boxes and everything, but it really wasn't like they were able to have a running air conditioner in the 30s in the middle of the Amazon. It's like, I'm betting that they had some Freon or something like that at that point in certain areas, but I don't think it was at all like a standardized thing.
Yeah, I think the technology was in existence at that point. It's got to be standardized and accepted and, available in a lot of places before you can just use it 18 hours up the river in the Amazon.
It was at this point in 1936, after they had actually had some success for a few years under Archibald Johnston, that the rubber trees essentially had to be culled entirely because they were built too close together. The year that they were supposed to go into production for rubber, they all had fungus and blight and parasites all over them because of how close they were planted. A botanist that was actually hired by Ford, probably way too late, this guy named Weir, showed up and told them all the things that they were doing wrong, that they were going to have to get rid of the entire crop, and basically disappeared without a trace. Like, he just left. Like, he didn't tell anybody that he wasn't coming back. He was just like, this is not going to work, and just outed. But, like, he
I thought you were going to say, he said, yeah, all of this work you guys did for 3 years and 150 people died, that's not going to produce anything, so you're going to want to fix it. And somebody took him outside and hit him with the shovel because they didn't want to hear it.
No, it wasn't. It
a lot
wasn't
of people
quite
getting hit with the shovel in this episode.
Yeah,
there's my brain's over there.
I mean, in the riots, I'm sure it happened, especially because they had segregated like the Americans away from the Brazilians. So whenever the riots happened, I have a feeling a lot of those houses took some damage from tools like that. Cursory efforts were made for many more years, but it wasn't until 1945 before the project was entirely abandoned. Most of the Americans who lived there left without warning, without bringing their belongings. They knew that it was just sold off. I think it was sold off for like $120,000 back to the Brazilian government, so they made a killing on that. And basically that was the end of Fordlandia. After a little while, some people started squatting in the town because prices were being driven up in some of the bigger cities that have grown since this time. And now the population has actually jumped up to about 2,000 as people found some of these houses that were sturdily built and have turned it into a small but kind of thriving community.
Oh, so it's not abandoned anymore.
No, it's not entirely abandoned.
If you go and see this...
Yeah, okay. There are huge swaths of it that are abandoned, but there are also like a lot of people that just took over the nicer houses. Like the things that are mostly abandoned are the giant like factory floors and things like that they were establishing. But... because of the quality of the materials. I don't think I've understood
the scale of this. What was the population of this at the peak?
It was over 5,000 at its peak.
Okay.
So, like, they built enough that there could have been up to 10,000, but a lot of those weren't very well made. A lot of those didn't have running water, but there was a good half of it that had running water and electricity. That Archibald Johnston guy was very good about making sure that, like, everything was set up in nice rows. They had, like, streetlights. They had everything set up, and it basically looked like a good American town. If you look at the pictures of it now, it still looks like it could be somewhere in the Midwest on a lake. There's a big water tower. There's nice-looking factories. Like, everything looks pretty nice about this place.
Yeah, the only problem is a lot of those houses get built like that because of where they are and, how the weather is and stuff. It seems like you can't always just transplant things one-to-one to another place and have it work out.
The exact replica of the Midwestern house was not a good idea for this area. Like, the ones that were just adobe with thatched roofing allowed it to be ventilated and allowed it to work right, but it didn't work with the executives back home, so they had to stop doing that.
Yeah, you gotta look American, darn it!
Yeah. It's gotta fit the vision.
This native nonsense. What do these guys know? They only live there for the entire existence of their, humanity.
Just generations on generations of building homes that make it so you don't die of heat stroke.
Oh, well.
That is the story of Fordlandia. There are so many bad ideas here, but most of it comes back to trust your experts and don't rush into things. It's like, if you had spaced the trees better, you might have gotten that. Also, shortly after all of this was done, they came out with synthetic rubber, and I think that was the final nail in the coffin for Fordlandia. But
oh, yeah.
I like that Ford was taking a chance and trying to make something cool out of this. It just was so horribly mismanaged. It could have been something great, but they just missed the mark.
You gotta have that give and take. And you already mentioned listening to the experts, but you have to be able to adapt. Ford seems like he had this vision of how exactly he wanted this thing to go, and he plowed ahead with making it look like the picture in his head rather than making it a workable thing that might actually produce something for him in the future.
Yeah. It's like whenever you had like the Soviet state having 5-year plans where they were going to produce something even if there was no demand for it, and they just ended up with tons of extra. It's like you have to be able to adapt on the fly, and you have to go with the needs of what the area actually requires.
Yeah, it's weird because on the one, it's the best idea is admitting that you had a bad idea and changing course. And it seems like in this instance, at least, Ford was not able to do that.
Yeah, and it would have only taken a little bit to at least make some of their money back, it seems like. Just a few changes here and there, and actually, a lot of it, I think, was also covered by the fact that they fired administrators, like, constantly. So as soon as somebody made one small mistake, they just ripped them out, put somebody new in there. So they never had any continuity, so people couldn't learn from their mistakes.
Man, I want to say what a garbage company. I mean, eventually they did manage to succeed. So somebody learned something eventually, or the upside of selling automobiles was just that great. But yowza.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all I have to say on Fordlandia. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes, or tell a friend about it. We would love it if you guys threw some reviews over on the podcast app on iTunes, and basically just let your friends know about bad ideas. We're trying to grow in the new year, and we want to thank you very, very much for listening.
We'll see you guys next time.